She said yes before he finished asking. You already know that matters. A woman, a snowstorm closing fast from the northwest, and a herd of cattle somewhere between a frozen creek and a ridge, nobody named yet on any map worth keeping. You know the kind of moment this is, the kind where everything ordinary about a person burns off, and what is left underneath either holds or it doesn't. It hold, by the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now. Let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? A woman named Clara Voss. A ranch that was 3 years into belonging to her and 9 months into belonging only to her. A man named Deshi Runningwater, who arrived at her gate on the 23rd day of November 1887 in the dark before dawn, with a dead man's letter in his coat and frost already needling the brim of his hat. And a question asked just before the real storm broke, that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it changed what she thought of herself, but because it was the first time since March that anyone had asked her anything she didn't already know the answer to. The thing about grief is that it teaches you a particular skill. It teaches you to fill every waking hour so completely that silence never finds a crack. Clara had become a master of that filling. She had 312 cattle, a hay barn. She had re-roofed herself in September, a border collie named Furl who slept under the stove, and a second pasture. She was fencing along one post at a time because wages were a luxury she had temporarily suspended. She rose before light. She did not stop until she could no longer see her hands. She called this efficiency. Her nearest neighbor, a stocky, plain-spoken German widow named Herta Bauer, who ran 60 sheep 2 miles east, called it something else. Herta had said it once, in October, over coffee gone cold at Clara's kitchen table. She had said, "Clara, you are not simplifying. You are disappearing." Then she had drunk the cold coffee anyway and said nothing more, because Herta understood that some truths needed saying only once. The one thin human thread that had stretched from Clara's old life to this present one had been a man named August Holt. August had been her husband's partner in the original cattle venture, the man who had helped Winslow Voss pick this particular stretch of Montana grassland, who had stood at the grave in March and held his hat with both hands and looked at the dirt for a long time without speaking. August had written to Clara twice since then. Plain letters, practical. How is the north fence holding? Whether she had found a reliable farrier. The kind of letters that were really asking, "Are you still there?" And she had answered them by writing back about fence and farriers. Then in October, she received a third letter. It was longer than the others. It was careful. It said that August was ill and that he did not expect to recover quickly, and it said that there was a young man, a man named Deshi Runningwater, who August had worked with for 4 years and trusted without qualification. As a last favor that was also in her own plain interest to consider him, it said that Deshi was the finest hand with horses and cattle August had ever employed. It said a few other things that Clara read twice and then folded the letter along its original creases and set it on the shelf above the fireplace, where it stayed for 17 days. She had not decided anything, she told herself. She was considering on the 23rd of November. Deshi Runningwater knocked on her gate post at 20 minutes before 5 in the morning. She heard it from inside because she was already up, because she was always already up, and because the knock was deliberate and unhurried. 3 strikes and then nothing. The kind of knock that did not apologize for itself. She took the shotgun from beside the door as a matter of habit, not fear, and went out onto the porch in her work coat and boots. The sky was still fully dark, and the wind was just beginning to suggest what it intended to become. She could see the shape of a man, and the shape of 2 horses, and a loaded pack animal. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Deshi Running Water. August Holt sent word. He told me what was in it." She held the shotgun low, not aimed, just present, and looked at him for a moment in the darkness. He looked back. He did not shift his weight or make explanatory gestures. He just stood with his horses and waited to be judged, which she understood to mean that he was accustomed to being judged, and had long ago decided not to perform for the process. She said, "You had better come in and have coffee." He tied his horses to the gate post and came in and had coffee. He sat at the table with his hat in his lap and his hands around the cup and looked at the kitchen in the way that a careful person looks at a new place, taking inventory without appearing to. Clara stood at the stove and watched him peripherally and noted that he drank the coffee without comment, which meant either that it was satisfactory or that he was polite. She would learn later that both were true. She put August's letter on the table between them. He read it, though she suspected he already knew the words. He set it back between them when he was done. He said, "I am not here because I need charity." She said, August didn't suggest charity. He suggested a job. He said, "I want to be clear about the distinction." She said, "I understood you the first time." A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable, just honest. The wind pushed at the kitchen window, and Clara looked at the sky, beginning to lighten at the edge, and calculated, the way she was always calculating, what the day would require. She said, "There's a bunkhouse. It hasn't been used since April." He said, "That's fine." She said, "Wages are $14 a month," and found, "That's what I paid before, and it's what I can pay now." He said, "That's fair." She said, "I want to see you work before I decide anything permanent." He said, "I'd expect that," and that was the agreement. Not signed, not sealed, just spoken across a table with a dead man's letter between them, and a storm coming from the northwest, and 312 cattle somewhere in the first pasture. She did not read the rest of August's letter until 3 days later. The part she had skipped the first time, the part she had told herself was peripheral, said this: "Clara, there is a second reason I'm sending him to you, and I will let you find it yourself because you are always better at finding things than I was at explaining them. Trust what you see more than what you expect." That was all. She folded it again and put it back on the shelf and went to check on the cattle. The storm arrived on the 26th of November, 3 days after Deshi did, as though it had been waiting to see whether he would stay. He had used those 3 days well. He had assessed her operation with a thoroughness that would have been offensive in a man who announced it. But Deshi did not announce anything. He simply appeared at the places that needed attending and attended to them. He noticed on the first morning that the near axle on the hay wagon was wearing unevenly, and he corrected the adjustment without saying anything, And Clara noticed the correction and did not say anything either. And that small shared silence was the first honest thing that passed between them. He noticed on the second day that her lead team, 2 Dark Bay mares, named in her records, only as Mare 1 and Mare 2, responded differently to each other in harness, and he spent an hour adjusting the traces until they moved as a unit. He had a way with horses that was neither showy nor soft. He simply paid attention, and the horses, who were themselves attentive animals, paid attention back. On the third morning, Clara was moving a load of hay to the south pasture and hit a frozen rut in the access lane that threw the wagon sideways and strained one of her traces. And Deshi appeared before she had finished assessing the damage, looked at it for 2 seconds, said, "I've got a spare," and went and got it. The repair took 11 minutes. She drove the rest of the load in silence, and he walked alongside without comment, and she felt the quality of his silence, and found it companionable in a way that surprised her, because for 9 months the only silence she had found companionable was her own. The storm on the 26th came in earnest before noon. Clara had moved the main herd to the home pasture the day before, in anticipation, all but 43 head that had drifted south through a gap she had not yet found in the fence line. She discovered the gap at 10 in the morning, and the temperature had already dropped 11 degrees since dawn, and the sky was the particular yellow-gray that meant the snow was not a question of weather, but of when and how much. She came back to the barn at a trot. Deshi was in the barn checking the team's feet. She said, 43 head south. There's a gap in the lower fence. She looked at the sky. We have maybe 3 hours. He said, "Can you drive a team through snow?" She looked at him. He said it plainly, not doubting her, genuinely asking, because it was the practical question. She said, "Since I was 12. He said, "Then let's go." They harnessed Mare 1 and Mare 2 together in 7 minutes and loaded the wagon with fence wire and posts and 2 days of provisions in case it came to that, and they went south through the beginning of the snow. Furl the border, Collie ran alongside. The wind was picking up from the northwest and carrying the snow sideways in the way that Montana wind does, finding every gap in a coat and every open inch of skin. Clara drove the team. Deshi sat beside her and watched the land, and she watched it too, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that the land was not already saying more clearly. They found the gap in the lower fence at 20 past 11. A section of wire, 20 feet wide, had failed at 2 of its staples, and the cattle had done the rest. Clara set the brake and climbed down and looked at the trail the 43 head had left going south. The tracks were already filling, she said. An hour at most on the tracks. He was already lifting fence posts from the wagon. She said, "Leave the fence. We get the cattle first." He set the post down and climbed back up. She turned the team south into the thickening snow. What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of the kind of work that does not look like anything in particular from the outside, but that takes everything a person has from the inside. The cattle had drifted into a shallow draw, half a mile south, where a stand of scrubby pine offered minimal shelter, and the animals' common sense had prevailed just barely over their instinct to keep moving. They were cold and bunched, and would have scattered again with a wrong approach. Clara came in from the east in a long arc, keeping the wind behind her, and Deshi went wide to the west, without being told to, and Furl read both of them and went south to hold the lead animals, and the three of them brought the 43 head around and north without losing a single one. It was not a graceful operation. The snow was driving hard by the second hour, and Clara's hands were numb in her gloves, and the mares were leaning into the wind with their ears pinned. She talked to them the whole time, not encouragingly, just informatively. She told them where the ground was and what was coming, and they listened in the way that good horses listen, with their feet as much as their ears. Daisy worked the west flank and kept the cattle moving, and she noticed when she could see him through the snow that he moved with a particular economy. No wasted motion, no panic, nothing that would transmit alarm to the animals. By nightfall, she had brought the whole herd home. By nightfall, all 312 were in the home pasture, and the gap in the south fence was patched, and the mares were in their stalls with extra hay. And Furl was asleep under the stove, and Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee that was already going cold, and she was not able to feel her left toes yet. She did not care Deshi came in from the barn. He sat down across from her. He did not say well done, or that was close, or any of the things a person says to relieve tension. He picked up his own coffee and drank it, and looked at the table, and Clara looked at the table, and after a while he said, "Your mares are good animals." She said, "They are." He said, "The near one. She has a look like she understands a larger thing." Clara said, "I've thought that too." Another silence. A different quality of silence than the ones before, she would think later. Something had shifted in it. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth. More like the quality of air in a room when two people have stopped measuring each other and started simply being in the same place. He said he was a fair man. She said he didn't give compliments. He didn't mean. Deshi said nothing to that, which was its own kind of answer. The days that followed the storm were numbered in the particular way that December days on the Montana plains are numbered, each one a small argument against the idea that spring will come again, each one requiring a response. The response was work, and they worked, and the work had a rhythm to it, now that it had not had before, because two people who are good at the same thing and who have learned each other's habits through 72 hours of close attention. Clara noticed things. She noticed that Deshi was up before her most mornings, which she would have resented from anyone else, and found instead simply true, a fact about the world, like the fact that the north wind was harder than the south. She noticed that he was teaching himself her operation not by asking questions, but by observing the results of things and reasoning backward, and she noticed when he had worked something out because a small adjustment would appear in the way a thing was done. She did not comment on the adjustments. He did not ask her to. She noticed that in the evenings, when the work was done and the animals were settled and the fire was built up, he would sometimes take out a small carved wooden implement, a kind of smoothing tool, and work on a piece of rawhide he was softening into something she could not yet identify. He worked on it slowly and with attention, the way he did everything, and the motion of it was quiet and methodical, and she found that it was easy to be in the same room with it. She did not ask what it was becoming. He did not say what he noticed, but she felt the noticing, the way she felt the presence of a careful animal in a field, something alive and attending. He noticed on the 8th day that she favored her right hand when lifting, and he went and found a better grip point on the water barrel without announcing this discovery. He noticed on the 12th day that she went out every evening just at dusk and stood at the high point of the north pasture for a few minutes before coming back in, and he did not follow her there, and he did not ask about it. On the 14th evening, she was standing at the north pasture rise, looking at the sky going from orange to purple, which was what she had come to do, when she heard his step. He had a reason, she understood. He had seen something in the east pasture he wanted to mention. He said what it was, a soft spot in the fence line near the creek that would need attention. She said she would see to it in the morning, and then neither of them went back to the house immediately. They stood there for a while at the high point and watched the sky go dark, and neither of them remarked on what they were doing, which was standing at the edge of what they both knew and looking at what was coming. On the 20th of December, Herta Bauer came over with a pot of something that smelled like cabbage and salvation, and stood in Clara's kitchen and looked at Daisy with the frank assessing calm of a woman who has outlasted one husband and several winters. She said to Daisy, "You are the man August sent." He said, "Yes." She said, "August had good judgment about people." He said, "I believe he did." She looked at Clara, and Clara looked at the pot of cabbage, and Herta made a sound that was not quite a word, but contained about 17 of them, and set the pot on the stove. She said, "Before I forget, there is a man, Harlan Stroud. He has been asking in Morro Falls about this place." Clara looked at her. Herta said, "Asking about your husband's debts, whether there were any outstanding loans, whether the deed was clear." Clara said, "Winslow had one loan at the Territorial Bank. I paid it in full in July. I have the receipt." Herta said, "I believe you. I am less certain Stroud will—" She said the name with the specific flatness that Clara recognized from Herta's other pronouncements, the kind that was not dramatic because the drama was already present in the facts and did not need help. Clara said, "What does Stroud want?" Herta said, "From what I understand, he wants the south quarter, which is the pasture with the creek. He says your husband promised him a note secured by that land. He says the note was never paid." Clara said, "That is not true." Herta said, "No, but he has a man called Fetters, who is currently acting as deputy, and Fetters is the kind of man who finds truth where he is paid to find it," as she had not spoken during this exchange. He stood with his arms at his sides and listened with the complete attention he brought to everything, and his face was not alarmed and not performatively calm, just present. After Herta left, Clara sat down at the table and thought about what she knew. She knew her deed. She knew her receipts. She knew that Winslow had never mentioned a man named Stroud. She knew that her south quarter with the creek was the difference between a ranch and a hardship, and that she had worked every post and wire of it herself. She thought about these things for a long time. Daisy put a fresh piece of wood on the fire. He said, "Do you have a lawyer?" She said, "There is a man named Aldous Crane in Morro Falls." She said, "Stroud may not come here." Daisy said, "He will come here. The question is whether you want to be ready." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. She said, "You've dealt with men like this before." He said, "Men who arrange things rather than ask for them." "Yes." She rode into Morro Falls the next morning, in cold that put ice crystals in the horse's nostrils. She found Aldous Crane in his narrow office above the dry goods, and explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she paid him for. And then he looked at her deed and her bank receipt, and a log she kept of all transactions, and he said, "Stroud has no legal instrument. Whatever he claims to hold is either a forgery or a fiction." She said, "Can you stop him?" Crane said, "I can make it very expensive for him to proceed. There is a circuit judge who comes to Morro Falls in February. If Stroud files anything, I will have it answered before the judge, and I will have your documentation, and I will have," he paused, "the additional issue of fetters, which is itself a problem for the county that several people have been looking for an occasion to address." She said, "How long do you need?" He said, "Give me a week to write some letters." She rode home. The cold came with her, but she sat straighter in it. Harlan Stroud came to her gate on the 28th of December. He came with 3 men. He was a heavy man with a full coat and a careful way of speaking that was designed to sound like reasonable conversation, and was in fact designed to sound like reasonable conversation. He had the particular confidence of a man who has won most of his arguments before they became arguments, who has arranged things for so long that he no longer distinguished arrangement from entitlement. Clara met him at the gate. Deshi stood beside the gate post to her left. He had come from the barn when he heard the horses, and he stood there, without any posture of aggression, just present, the way he was always present. But the 3 men noticed him and adjusted their positioning slightly. "Stroud," said Mrs. Voss, "I am sorry to come at this time of year." He gestured at the cold as though he had arranged it too. Clara said, "Mr. Stroud." He said, "I think you may have a gap in your record-keeping regarding a note your husband held on the south quarter of this property. I've come to help you understand the situation." He said, "There may be some confusion about the dates." She said, "There is no confusion. My deed is clear. My husband's one debt to the Territorial Bank was paid in July. I have the receipt. I have spoken with Aldous Crane, who holds copies of all relevant documents." Something shifted in Stroud's expression. Not much. A small tightening. He said, "Crane is not always the final word on these matters. The circuit judge who arrives in February is." One of his men looked at another of his men. Stroud was quiet for a moment, resetting. He said, "I had hoped we could resolve this simply." She said, "It is simple. Come back with a legal instrument and I will answer it through my attorney. Come back without one and I will ask you to leave." He looked at Deshi. It was the look that men like Stroud gave to unexpected variables. He looked back at Clara. He said, "I'll be in touch, Mrs. Voss." She said, "Through Aldous Crane." He nodded once, very slightly, as a man who has not yet lost, but knows he has not yet won, and he turned his horse and went back down the lane with his 3 men, and the frozen January air closed behind them, as though they had never been there. Clara did not move from the gate until they were out of sight. Then she put her hand on the top rail of the gate and kept it there for a moment, not for support, but to have something solid under her palm. Deshi said, "You did that well." She said, "He'll come back." Deshi said, "Probably, but it will cost him more each time." She said, "Thank you for being there." He said, "That's what I'm here for." There were things in that simple sentence that both of them heard and neither of them named, and that was all right. Naming was not always the first step. The naming came 18 days later, on the 15th of January. She had been thinking about August's letter. The second part, the part that said there is a second reason, and I will let you find it yourself. She had been thinking about it in the way she thought about the alignment of fence posts, standing back and looking from a distance until the line became clear. She thought about what she knew. She knew Deshi had been with August for 4 years. She knew he was 31 years old. She knew he was careful and honest and competent, and that the competence was not the kind that needed an audience. She knew that the south fence was better, since he had walked it. She knew that her mares moved better, since he had adjusted their harness. Why? She knew that she had stood at the north pasture rise twice more in the evening since the 14th, and that both times he had come and stood there too for a while, and that this had seemed entirely natural both times. She knew that she was 42 years into a life that had included 15 years with Winslow and 9 months without him, and that the 9 months had taught her the precise difference between solitude and loneliness. She went to find him in the barn that evening. He was finishing the rawhide piece she saw, wrapping it into a final shape, and he set it aside when she came in. She said, "I've been thinking about August's letter." The part about the second reason, he looked at her. She said, "I think I know what it was." She paused. "I think he wasn't only trying to find you a situation." Deshi was quiet. She said, "He knew that I would work myself into a single fixed point if something didn't change that. He was practical enough to put the two problems together and see if one might answer the other. I think what I am trying to say is that I am not asking you this because of any obligation or because it makes practical sense, even though it does. I am asking you because it is what I want." She looked up at him. "I would like you to stay, not as a hired hand, as my husband, if you'll have me." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something settling into a shape it had been finding its way toward. He said, "I want to be clear about something first." She said, "Say it." He said, "I am not staying because August asked me to or because you need a man on this property. I was ready to go if you'd asked me to after 30 days. She said, "I know that." He said, "And I want to keep my name." She said, "I would not ask you to change it." He said, "And I have my own ways. Some of them you'll recognize and some you won't. I don't find them difficult." He considered for a moment more, not hesitating. She understood, but being exact, which was how he did everything. He said, "Then yes." She said, "Yes." Just two people who had come to the same true conclusion and said so. They rode into Morrow Falls 3 days later, and Aldous Crane drew the papers. He said with complete and evident satisfaction that he was delighted to record this and that the joint ownership registration would additionally, not that this was the reason, considerably complicate any further action by Harlan Stroud regarding the South Quarter, since the ranch would now stand on 2 documented legal persons, one of whom had a clear title history and one of whom brought no debts whatsoever. He said it would cost Stroud a great deal more than a few hired men to proceed, and that he expected Stroud to do the arithmetic and find other arrangements. Stroud did the arithmetic. He came back once in the first week of February with 5 men this time, and a piece of paper he called a promissory note in Winslow Voss's handwriting. But the circuit judge had arrived early on account of a postponed docket from December, and Crane had been waiting for exactly this. And the document went before the judge the following morning and was found to have several inconsistencies with Winslow Voss's known signature and with the Territorial Bank's own records. And the judge said several things to Fetters, the deputy, and Stroud rode out of Morro Falls on the 9th of February and did not come back. The south pasture, the one with the creek, stayed exactly where it had always been, fenced and watered and quiet under the February sky. There is a thing that happens to a place when it has 2 heartbeats in it instead of 1. It is not a dramatic thing. It shows in small ways and in the accumulation of small ways over time. It shows in the way a second pair of boots appears by the door and looks, after a while, as though they have always been there. It shows in a language, Deshi's first language, which had its own words for weather and for animals and for the quality of particular silences, and which Clara asked him to teach her. 1 word at a time, in the evenings, until she had 17 words. Those attentive animals seemed to find this entirely reasonable. It shows in the rawhide object he had been making, which turned out to be a specific kind of smooth-edged working tool suited to her hand size and better for certain tasks than anything she owned, which he set on the workbench without ceremony one morning. It shows in the way the evening ritual at the North Pasture Rise became a shared, 1-2 people standing at the edge of what they knew and looking at what was coming, sometimes talking. Winslow Voss was not replaced. That was not what had happened. Clara thought about this clearly and often, and without grief's old companion, guilt. Winslow had loved this land and had worked it, and had died 9 months into the project of their shared life here. And there was no mending that, and she had stopped trying to mend it. What she had done instead, with no plan and no map, was to stay and to work, and to receive what arrived at her gate in the dark before dawn, and to let it in time become part of what she was building. She kept August's letter. She did not read it again for a long time, but she kept it on the shelf where she had put it in October, and sometimes in the evening she looked at it from across the room and thought about what it meant that a man, lying ill in November, had thought carefully about 2 people he cared about, and sent one of them to the other, with the instruction to trust what you see more than what you expect. August did not see spring. Clara and Deshi rode to the small town where August had his room, and stood at his grave together in the early March wind, which was cold but no longer fierce, the cold of a season ending. Deshi held his hat in both hands and looked at the ground. Clara stood beside him. She did not try to find the right words, because she had learned by then that the right words in certain moments are not the point. The point is, who stands beside you. She had lost a husband she loved. She had been found by a man she was learning to love in a different way. The way of 2 people who came to each other already shaped by life, and who fit together not because they had been made for each other, but because they had both become, through separate hard work and loss, the kind of people who knew how to fit. A thing mended right is not the same as a thing that never broke. It has seams, yes, but it has been paid attention to. That is its own kind of strength. In April, when the ground softened and the fence posts could be driven again without injury, Clara and Deshi walked the entire perimeter of the property together, all 4 sections. They walked it in 2 days, checking every post and every wire, and Clara showed him the places she had built herself and the places where Winslow had built before her. And Deshi showed her the places that needed attention, and she showed him the places she had already reinforced against the last hard winter, and they talked about what the spring work would require, and then walked on. On the second afternoon, they reached the gap in the south fence where the 43 cattle had pushed through in the November storm, the gap they had come out in the blizzard to correct. The wire was solid. Now, the posts were set right. Deshi stopped beside her. She said, "This is where I was when I first understood what you were." He said, "What do I mean to you?" She said, "Not a problem I solved, a thing that held." He considered this. Then he said, "For me, it was the mares. The way you talked to them in the storm." She said, "What did that tell you?" He said, "That you knew." They stood there for a moment at the mended fence line in the April light, which was warm for the first time in months, and which lay on the grass and the wire and the dark-turned earth like something being offered rather than demanded. She said, "Shall we keep going?" He said yes. They kept going. The south pasture was full that year. The creek ran clear from snowmelt and then settled in June to its summer voice, low and deliberate, the sound of a thing that knows where it is going. The cattle were 319 by the summer count, the winter losses replaced and exceeded by 7. The mares, Mare 1 and Mare 2, went about their work with the quiet authority of animals who have been understood. The north pasture rise, their rise by habit now, showed them the same sky it had always shown, but it had more to show them, because there were 2 of them to see it, and 2 understandings to bring to what they saw. In the evenings of summer, after the work was done and the light was long and the air held warmth for once rather than demanding heat, they would go up together as a matter of course, and stand and watch. Clara would sometimes say the words in Deshi's language, the ones she was still learning, the ones that name the quality of a particular evening light or the sound of the creek at summer depth, and he would listen and sometimes correct her pronunciation. A debt became something else. An arrival became a staying became a life. It began, all of it, with a woman standing on a porch, in the dark before dawn, with a shotgun at her side, and a man with frost on his hat who did not apologize for being there, and a letter on a shelf with a second reason. She said yes before he finished asking, and by nightfall, she had brought the whole herd home, and the next night, and the night after. And the seasons turned the way seasons do, indifferent to small human arrangements, and yet somehow always present at them, always providing the coal that tests the fence and the light that makes the effort visible, and the 2 people on the Montana plain paid attention to both, and built what they built out of what they had, which was more. A thing mended right is not the same as a thing that never broke. It has been paid attention to. That is not a consolation. That is the point.